Okay, thank you for joining Shelby and me. We are very excited to be reading chapter 12 of A Wrinkle in Time today. It's the last chapter of the book, and we're super excited to find out what happens. Is Meg able to rescue Charles Wallace? Will they be able to return home? Will they be able to defeat evil? We cannot wait to find out. So go ahead and open your books. The chapter 12 is titled The Foolish and the Weak. Let's get started. Meg could see nothing, but she felt her heart pounding with hope. With one accord, all the beasts rose to their feet, turned toward one of the arched openings, and bowed their heads and tentacles in greeting. Mrs. Whatsit appeared standing between two columns. Beside her came Mrs. Who. Behind them, a quivering of light. The three of them were somehow not quite the same as they had been when Meg had first seen them. Their outlines seemed blurred. Colors ran together as in the wet water color painting, but they were there. They were recognizable. They were themselves. Meg pulled herself away from Aunt Beast, jumped to the floor, and rushed at Mrs. Whatsit. But Mrs. Whatsit held up a warning hand, and Meg realized that she was not completely materialized, and she was light and not substance, and embracing her now would have been like trying to hug a sunbeam. We had to hurry, so there wasn't quite time. You wanted us? Mrs. Whatsit asked. The tallest of the beasts bowed again and took a step away from the table and toward Mrs. Whatsit. It is a question of the little boy. Father left him, Meg cried. He left him on Camazotz. Appallingly, Mrs. Whatsit's voice was cold. And what do you expect us to do? Meg pressed her knuckles against her teeth so that her braces cut her skin. Then she flung out her arms pleadingly. But it's Charles Wallace. It has him. Mrs. Whatsit, save him. Please save him. You know that we can do nothing on Camazotz, Mrs. Whatsit said, her voice still cold. You mean you'll let Charles be caught by it forever? Meg's voice rose shrilly. Did I say that? But we can't do anything. You know we can't. We tried, Mrs. Whatsit. You have to save him. Meg, this is not our way, Mrs. Whatsit said sadly. I thought you would know that this is not our way. Mr. Murray took a step forward and bowed, and to Meg's amazement, the three ladies bowed back to him. I don't believe we've been introduced, Mrs. Whatsit said. It's Father. You know it's Father. Meg's angry impatience grew. Father, Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch. I'm very glad to, Mr. Murray mumbled, then went on. I'm sorry, my glasses are broken and I can't see you very well. It's not necessary to see us, Mrs. Whatsit said. If you could teach me enough more about the Tesseract so that I can get back to Camazotz. What then? Came Mrs. Witch's surprising voice. I will try to take my child away from it. And you know that you will not succeed? There's nothing left except to try. Mrs. Whatsit spoke gently. I'm sorry, we cannot allow you to go. Then let me, Calvin suggested. I almost got him away before. Mrs. Whatsit shook her head. No, Calvin. Charles has gone even deeper into it. You will not be permitted to throw yourself in with him, for that, you must realize, is what would happen. There was a long silence. All the soft rays filtering into the great hall seemed to concentrate on Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and the faint light that must be Mrs. Witch. No one spoke. One of the beasts moved a tendril slowly back and forth across the stone tabletop. At last, Meg could stand it no longer, and she cried out despairingly. Then what are you going to do? Are you just going to throw Charles away? Mrs. Witch's voice rolled formidably across the hall. Silence, child. But Meg could not be silent. She pressed closely against Aunt Beast, but Aunt Beast did not put the protecting tentacles around her. I can't go, Meg cried. I can't. You know I can't. Did anybody ask you to? The grim voice made Meg's skin prickle into goose flesh. She burst into tears. She started beating at Aunt Beast like a small child having a tantrum. Her tears rained down her face and spattered Aunt Beast's fur. Aunt Beast stood quietly against the assault. All right, I'll go, Meg sobbed. I know you want me to. We want nothing from you that you do without grace, Mrs. Whatsit said, or that you do without understanding. Meg's tears stopped as abruptly as they had started. But I do understand. She felt tired and unexpectedly peaceful. Now that the coldness that under Aunt Bee's administrations had left her body had also left her mind. She looked toward her father and her confused anger was gone, and she felt only love and pride. She smiled at him, asking forgiveness, and then pressed up against Aunt Beast. This time, Aunt Beast's arm went around her. Mrs. Witch's voice was grave. What do you understand? That it has to be me. It can't be anyone else. I don't understand Charles, but he understands me. I'm the one who's closest to him. Father's been away for so long, since Charles Wallace was a baby. They don't know each other, and Calvin's only known Charles for such a little time. If it had been longer, then he would have been the one. But oh, I see, I understand. It has to be me. There isn't anyone else. Mr. Murray, who had been sitting, his elbows on his knees, his chin on his fist, rose. I will not allow it. Why? Mrs. Witch demanded. Look, I don't know what or who you are, and at this point, I don't care. I will not allow my daughter to go alone into this danger. Why? You know what the outcome will probably be, and she's weak now, weaker than she was before. She was almost killed by the black thing. I fail to understand how you can even consider such a thing. Calvin jumped up. Maybe it's right about you, or maybe you're in league with it. I'm the one to go if anybody goes. Why did you bring me along at all? To take care of Meg? You said so yourself. But you have done that, Mrs. Whatsit assured him. I haven't done anything, Calvin shouted. You can't send Meg. I won't allow it. I'll put my foot down. I won't permit it. Don't you see that you're making something that is already hard for Meg even harder, Mrs. Whatsit asked. Aunt Beast turned tentacles toward Mrs. Whatsit. Is she strong enough to test her again? You know what she has been through. If Witch takes her, she can manage, Mrs. Whatsit said. If it will help, I will go too and hold her. Aunt Beast's arm around Meg tightened. Oh, Aunt Beast, Meg started. But Mrs. Whatsit cut her off. No, I was afraid not, Aunt Beast said humbly. I just wanted you to know that I would. Mrs. Whatsit? Mr. Murray frowned and pushed his hair back from his face. Then he shoved with a middle finger at his nose as though he were trying to get spectacles closer to his eyes. Are you remembering that she is only a child? And she's backward, Calvin bellowed. I resent that, Meg said hotly, hoping that indignation would control her trembling. I'm better than you at math, and you know it. Do you have the courage to go alone? Mrs. Whatsit asked her. Meg's voice was flat. No, but it doesn't matter. She turned to her father and Calvin. You know it's the only thing to do. You know they'd never send me alone if... How do we know you're not in a league with it? Mr. Murray demanded. Father! No, Meg, Mrs. Whatsit said. I do not blame your father for being angry and suspicious and frightened. And I cannot pretend that we are doing anything but sending you into the gravest kind of danger. I have to acknowledge quite openly that it may be a fatal danger. I know this, but I do not believe it, and the happy medium doesn't believe it either. Can't she see what's going to happen? Calvin asked. Oh, not in this kind of thing. Mrs. Whatsit sounded surprised at his question. If we knew ahead of time what was going to happen, we'd be like the people in Camazotz, with no lives of our own, with everything all planned and done for us. How can I explain it to you? Oh, I know. In your language, you have a form of poetry called the sonnet. Yes, Calvin said impatiently. What's that got to do with the happy medium? Kindly pay me the courtesy of listening to me. Mrs. Whatsit's voice was stern, and for a moment, Calvin stopped pawing the ground like a nervous colt. It is a very strict form of poetry, is it not? Yes. There are 14 lines, I believe, all in an iambic pentameter. That's a very strict rhythm or meter, yes? Yes, Calvin nodded. And each line has to end with a rigid rhyme pattern, and if the poet does not do it exactly this way, it is not a sonnet, is it? No. But within this strict form, the poet has complete freedom to say whatever he wants, doesn't he? Yes, Calvin nodded again. So, Mrs. Whatsit said. So what? Oh, do not be stupid, boy, Mrs. Whatsit scolded. You know perfectly well what I am driving at. You mean you're comparing our lives to a sonnet, a strict form, but freedom within it? Yes, Mrs. Whatsit said. You're given the form, but you have to write the sonnet yourself. What you say is completely up to you. Please, Meg said, please, if I've got to go, I want to go and get it over with. Each minute you put it off makes it harder. She is right, boomed Mrs. Witch's voice. It is time. You may say goodbye. Mrs. Witch was giving her not permission, but a command. Meg curtsied clumsily to the beast. Thank you all very much. I know you saved my life. She did not add what she could not help thinking. Saved it for what? So that it could get me? She put her arms about Aunt Beast, pressed up against the soft, fragrant fur. Thank you, she whispered. I love you. And I, you, little one. Aunt Beast pressed gentle tendrils against Meg's face. Cal, Meg said, holding out her hand. Calvin came to her and took her hand, then drew her roughly to him and kissed her. He didn't say anything, and he turned away before he had a chance to see the surprised happiness that brightened Meg's eyes. At last, she turned to her father. I'm sorry, Father. He took both her hands in his, bent down to her with short-sighted eyes. Sorry for what, Megatron? Tears almost came to her eyes at the gentle use of the old nickname. I wanted you to do it all for me. I wanted everything to be all easy and simple. So I tried to pretend that it was all your fault because I was scared and I didn't want to have to do anything myself. But I wanted to do it for you, Mr. Murray said. That's what every parent wants. He looked into her dark, frightened eyes. I won't let you go, Meg. I am going. No, Mrs. Whatsit's voice was sterner than Meg had ever heard it. You are going to allow Meg the privilege of accepting this danger. You are a wise man, Mr. Murray. You are going to let her go. Mr. Murray sighed. He drew Meg close to him. Little Megaparsec, don't be afraid to be afraid. We will try to have courage for you. That is all we can do. Your mother was always shoving me out in the world, Meg said. She'd want me to do this. You know she would. Tell her. She started, choked, then held up her head and said, No, never mind. I'll tell her myself. Good girl. Of course you will. Now Meg walked slowly around the great table to where Mrs. Whatsit was still poised between the columns. Are you going with me? No, only Mrs. Witch. The black thing. Fear made her voice tremble. When Father tested me through it, it almost got me. Your father is singularly inexperienced, Mrs. Whatsit said, though a fine man and worth teaching. At the moment, he still treats Tessering as though he were working with a machine. We will not let the black thing get you, I don't think.